Good evening, everyone. My name is Silas. Welcome to Brookline Booksmith's author event series and our new event space. A few housekeeping notes: please keep your phones on silent. If you haven't picked up a pre-ordered book or you'd like to buy a book, you can do so at the desk in the back, right over there, after the event. And there will be time for Q&A, so keep your questions, but get them ready in your mind. We're here tonight to celebrate the release of I Could Live Here Forever with author Hanna Halperin in conversation with our moderator, Joanna Rakoff. Joanna is the author of the international best-selling memoir, My Salinger Year, and the best-selling novel, A Fortunate Age, winner of the Goldberg Prize for Fiction and the Elle Readers Prize. Rakoff's book has been translated into 20 languages, and the film adaptation of My Salinger Year opened in theaters worldwide in 2021. She has been a recipient of fellowships and residencies from MacDowell, Swanee, Bredlow, Jerome Foundation, Authors Guild, Penn, Ragdale Foundation, ART, OMI, Leadhig House, and Saltonstall. Appeared in New York Times, The Guardian, O, the Oprah Magazine, Vogue, and elsewhere, and her new memoir, The Fifth Passenger, is forthcoming from Little Brown in 2024. Welcome, Joanna. Hanna Halperin is the author of Something Wild, which won the 2021 Edward Louis Welland Award and was a finalist for the 2021 National Jewish Book Award for debut fiction. Her stories have been published in the Kenyon Review, N+1, New Ohio Review, and Joyland. She has taught fiction workshops at Grub Street in Boston and worked as a domestic violence counselor. Welcome, Hanna. I Could Live Here Forever is a gripping portrait of a tumultuous, consuming relationship between a young woman and a recovering addict. When Leah Kempler meets Charlie Nelson in line at the grocery store, their attraction is immediate and intense. Charlie, with his big feelings and grand proclamations of love, captivates her completely. But there are peculiarities of his life. He's older with her, but still lives with his parents. He meets up with a friend at the odd hours of the night and sleeps a lot and always seems to be coming down from something. He confesses that he's a recovering heroin addict, but he promises Leah that he's never going to use again. Leah's friends and family are concerned as she finds herself getting deeper into an isolated relationship, one of manipulation and denial. The truth about Charlie feels as blurry as their first time together. Even when Charlie's behavior becomes increasingly erratic, when he starts to make Leah feel unsafe, she can't help but feel that what exists between them is destined. Charlie is wide, open, boyish, and unbearably handsome. The bounds of Leah's own pain and love are so deep that she can't see him spiraling into self-destruction. Hanna Halperin writes with aching vulnerability and intimacy, sharply attuned to Leah's desire for an all-consuming, compulsive connection. I Could Live Here Forever exposes the chasm between perception and truth to tell an intoxicating story of one woman's relationship with an addict, the accompanying swirl of compassion and codependence, and her enduring search for wholeness and love. Here to tell us more are Joanna Rakoff and Hanna Halperin.
Hey, you guys, it's so exciting to see this huge crowd here for Hanna. I love this book so much. I'll just quickly tell you a little run of show. Hanna's going to read, and then I will ask her. I have a million questions, but I'll sort of restrain myself to just a few. And then you guys will ask questions, and then she will sign books. So I'm so excited to hear her read from this book, which I love so much.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Joanna, for doing this with me. I'm going to read from the first chapter. I'll skip the first few pages, but this is just to give you a little context, Leah has gone on one date with Charlie, and she's already fallen pretty hard, and he's about to pick her up for their second date. And they're going over to his house. The next night, I was ready and waiting for him by 7:30. He didn't show up at 8 like he said, but he texted saying he was running late. When he finally did call to say he was outside, it was after 9. I glanced at myself once more in the mirror. I was wearing my good jeans and another sweater, navy ribbed, with a mock turtleneck. This time my hair was up for some variation. When I got into his car, it reeked of cigarettes. After thinking about him a lot for the past 2 days, I had forgotten what he looked like. Like studying something up close for too long, my memory of him had become blurry. But sliding into the passenger seat, I was stunned all over again. He was beautiful, a mix between Johnny Depp and Jake Gyllenhaal. This time, he was wearing a multicolored pullover fleece like a dad. "Hello," I said. "How's it going?" His voice was even softer and less animated than it had been on the phone. Neither one of us knew what to say after that, and we made small talk, the kind that made me feel uninteresting. We didn't laugh or seem to have anything in common this time. The drive was longer than I expected it to be, and at some point I realized that we were leaving the city and driving into the suburbs. When we pulled up to a large split-level house with stone siding, a 2-car garage attached, and a nice lawn out front, I was confused. "You live here?" He nodded. "By yourself?" "I live with my mom and stepdad." I let the information settle. When he had invited me over, I'd assumed he lived alone, and he was pretty old. "They're asleep," he said softly when he led me inside. "We can go to the den." All the lights were off, but I could see that the house was very neat. There was no clutter. It smelled clean too, like fresh laundry and lemon soap. The state of the house was in such opposition to the inside of Charlie's car, with the stench of cigarettes, the layer of trash and empty soda cans, and paper bags on the floor, that it was hard to connect the two spaces to the same person. I followed him through a hallway and down 3 carpeted steps to a separate wing. The room he brought me to, the den, was brown. Brown carpeting, brown wallpaper, brown lumpy furniture. There was a flat screen TV and video game consoles sprawled in front of it. On the far side of the room was a mini fridge and a sink and a table with a few stools. "Make yourself at home," Charlie said. "Do you want soda or something? Water?" To be honest, I don't really drink that much. It occurred to me then to be nervous. I hadn't been up until that moment. The room itself was creepy, and I didn't know where I was. Nobody knew where I was. I hadn't texted Charlie's address to my friends like he'd suggested. I hadn't wanted anyone to tell me not to go. The only thing that made me feel slightly comforted was that I could feel the presence of the sleeping parents in some other part of the house. Sorry. I considered asking Charlie to drive me home, but I felt bad doing that. The drive had been a good 35 minutes. I figured the best thing to do was to stay for a little while and then ask to be taken home in an hour or 2. "I'll have some water." I smiled politely. "Thanks." He brought a glass of water and a can of A&W root beer from the fridge back to the couch where I had sat down. "Want to watch something?" he asked. "Okay." He turned on the TV. Underneath my fear, I was disappointed. This all seemed boring, especially after the date we'd had 2 nights before, laughing, sharing stories, and the way he'd called me the next day, how self-assured he'd sounded on the phone. I didn't want him to be just some guy who lived with his parents, who invited me over to watch TV. I wondered sadly if we were 2 losers on a bad date. He was too handsome to be a loser, though. "You're really quiet tonight," he said, turning to me. "I guess I'm nervous." "Why are you nervous?" He looked offended, or maybe I thought he was disappointed by me, my quietness. I wasn't sure how things had become so strange so quickly between us. "I don't know," I admitted. "It's just the beginning of getting to know each other, so..." He seemed to consider this. "Sometimes I don't always know how to He paused. I get worried about overstepping my bounds. What do you mean? Well, on our first date, I really wanted to kiss you. You did? Of course. Well, I shrugged, you should have. When I looked at him, a softness had come back into his eyes. He wasn't disappointed with me, I realized. He was nervous too. I'm gonna try something. He kissed me then, and as soon as we were touching, I wasn't scared anymore. I was no longer shy. We pulled each other closer. His hair and his clothes smelled like cigarettes. When he pulled off his fleece, his hair stood straight up with static, and I smoothed it down. Underneath, he had on a plain white t-shirt, like the one he'd been wearing on our first date. He was so thin I could feel each of his ribs. He kissed softly, almost a little sleepily, like he wasn't in a hurry. His lips were soft and he tasted fresh and sour at the same time, like tobacco and toothpaste and coffee, and kind of cool like air. I'd never felt that way kissing anyone before. I desperately didn't want it to end.
I love what you read, and it gets at so much of what I love about the book. But anyway, okay, I'll stop rambling about that. Okay, so let's start from the beginning. Where did this novel start? Like, did it start with Leah? Did it start with Charlie? Did it start with wanting to write about addiction?
I think it started with both of them. It actually began with an essay that I was writing after my first novel, Something Wild, came out, which has a lot to do with domestic violence. And you know, they want you to like write these essays that have to do with your novel, like to sort of help promote the novel. And I was working on this essay, sort of like how I got involved with domestic violence work. And the essay was really not coming together. It really wasn't working. And I found myself sort of like going off onto these tangents about like basically feelings of what it's like to be in relationships with really high highs and really low lows, and realized that I was more interested in like writing a story about what basically like getting into what that felt like, and not necessarily like writing about an abusive relationship, but just how like the cyclical nature of being in a relationship like that. And I had the idea for Charlie and Leah, and I was interested in writing about addiction, but I knew that as much as I wanted to write about addiction and drug addiction, I wanted to write sort of about what it was like to feel addicted to another person, and sort of how those two, I've never personally, struggled with addiction to drugs, but sort of how we can feel addicted in other ways, and how those things might mirror each other.
And then how did you end up turning that initial material, that essay, into, did that become the beginning of I Could Live Here Forever?
Yeah, I kind of had this idea for these two characters, and I wrote the first scene of them meeting, and I wrote the first draft like pretty quickly, yeah, it was really those two characters. They kind of came to me like through writing them, kind of like really getting into each scene. It was. I didn't plan it out ahead of time. It was sort of scene by scene, and it. Yeah, I guess that's what it was.
As you went forward with it, did
Yeah.
you end up immersing yourself in research, in terms of the addiction component of it, or did you kind of feel your way, or?
Yeah, I had been like researching addiction, like particularly heroin addiction, for like probably for years. Like I'd been close to someone who struggled with heroin addiction, and so it kind of like entered into my consciousness for that reason. And I think like once it was in my head, like kind of in the same way like once domestic violence was in my head, like I was noticing it everywhere. And whether it was like in the news or just like in my life in other ways or in movies or in books. And so it's not like I went into the book and then I would like be like, this is my research time and this is my writing time. But like research was sort of had like led up to writing it naturally for so many years. And then once I sat down to write it, it was all sort of like there. And then, probably in the editing process, I went back and did more research, but it felt like it was sort of like my mind had been steeping in it for so long.
Yeah, it's a journalist friend of mine likes to say there's no wasted time when you're a writer. Like you end up kind of going down these research pathways just out of your own personal interest, but it all sort of feeds into something down the road.
Right.
Wait, I'm just gonna pause here and say, who has read I Could Live Here Forever so far? Okay, I always just like to know, because if everyone has read it, then I don't have to explain that much, And so, in the novel, you, in a very kind of subtle, sly way, take Leah into pretty dark places. And I wondered, as I was thinking about talking to you, what the experience of writing the book was like. Sometimes I know this from personal experience, writing about difficult things and taking your characters down scary roads can be mentally really hard to take. And I just wondered what it was like for you.
Yeah, it's a weird answer because I was like pretty happy while I was writing it, but I was not happy right before I wrote it. Like I was in like I wrote it during the pandemic, and I actually like was just working on an essay like writing about the writing process. So I was like remembering sort of my headspace going into writing it and like how I did write it. And like right before I wrote it, I was living alone, very single at the time, very lonely, and was just like spending like days on end by myself, and like wasn't talking to anyone, and like was spending a lot of time on my phone, spending a lot of time like just like remembering, like being like, is this how the world is gonna be like forever? There was like articles coming out being like, we're never gonna hug again. And so I was like remembering like, past relationships and I think I like needed to like get into a different world essentially, like and so I started writing about this relationship that like, and in some ways, Leah and Charlie are both people who like really need to escape their realities, and they do it in very different ways, but it's one of the reasons they connect is because they both are so like needing to escape, but I think I was doing that to some extent too. I was like, I need to like, at least like escape like the studio apartment like reality of the pandemic, and so I like dove into this fictional world, this fictional relationship, but it like really like it really woke me up. Like I was like just way happier. I was getting up early. I was working on it like all the time. I was like taking tons of walks. Like I was just thinking about it all the time, and it was the fastest I'd ever written anything, because I felt there was such like an urgency to their relationship, and I felt very like caught up in that urgency, and then I think like editing it, so I almost felt like a bit emotionally removed from like the dark places that they were at, because I felt like I was like creating it almost. I don't know if you feel that at all, like when you're like working on something, but then when I was revising it and I was like reading it more from like looking down on it, like bird's eye view of like, oh, what did I just write? I was like, oh, this is really sad, and like it was like I felt like I needed to take breaks more often, and it was like a more emotionally draining to work on it, and yeah.
Yeah, it's for me, there's this way in which, and I felt this as I was reading it, I wonder if those of you who read it also felt this way. It almost felt like a horror movie in which, because the way that, in a way it's a coming of age story, right? In which Leah is, much more kind of naive than Ryu, in writing the book, and doesn't see the signs that Charlie is an addict, is lying to her about all sorts of things, and also possibly a dangerous narcissist, but whatever. But you, the reader, see this no matter how old you are, most likely, and so you kind of are like, don't go in the house, like you want to say to her, like, please no, just and there are all these moments when her family is like, break up with him now, and instead she kind of like goes deeper in, and I was so interested in the way you constructed the story. Did you sort of make a choice to have her be quite she's quite young.
Yeah.
So that's part of it, but she also, I think, has had a somewhat sheltered existence. Were you thinking that it would kind of have this arc that like the reader would kind of see things a little bit more clearly than she does?
Yeah, I was wondering like how, because you're so deep into Leah's point of view, and it is like a very, you're in the first person, and so I was like wondering like, how what so I was so in Leah's point of view too, and so that was a question I was like constantly kind of like asking myself, like as the writer, like how much how much is the reader gonna like see around what Leah's not seeing, and how much is the reader gonna be like very situated in Leah's point of view, and I didn't quite know. I didn't quite know like what the reader's experience was gonna be like, in terms of that, and like in terms of like especially their reaction to Charlie. I think like one of the interesting things to me about writing the book was like I myself as the writer was like I was constantly trying to figure out who Leah and Charlie were, and like what or not trying to figure out. I actually was like trying to stop myself from figuring it out, but like there were times where I was writing a scene and I really believed like their love, and I was like, I do think that like this sounds very kind of cliche and naive, but like I do believe that they are in some sense like saving each other. There's something very sweet about them. And then there were some times where I was writing scenes between them where I was like, this is so dangerous and so manipulative, and it made like the earlier scenes that I was writing feel manipulative, and it didn't feel like love. And like I was very wary to like use words to myself like abusive or toxic or words like that to describe one of them or either of them or the relationship, because I just didn't want to risk like flattening them, like at least while I was writing, and even while it's coming out, I'm like, I don't know how readers are going to react to the relationship. I don't know if it's going to seem like, you know, horrible or romantic or a mix, or yeah, that it was mysterious to me while I was writing it.
I think that's part of the magnificence of the novel, you know, in that there's this kind of ambiguity, like you are in Leah's head and you don't, you know, you see her kind of shifting perspective, and I found myself trying not to kind of label it, you know, as the reader too, being like, okay, wait, maybe they are really in love, maybe he does really love her, I don't know, I can't, you know, and so you said, you know, you wrote it in this kind of big rush, and I think reading it, you have that kind of same experience. It feels very kind of propulsive, and you kind of can't put it down. That was my experience. I'm gonna leave the subject of the relationship just for a second to ask you a question that is sort of like vaguely random, but I wondered if other people might be interested in, which is, so the book is set largely in Madison.
Yeah. And
Hearing that you were writing it during lockdown, I was curious about that, and curious about, I'm asking two questions at once. Let me step back and just calm down. So before I knew you were during lockdown, I was thinking, I'm so interested in the way setting plays a role in all fiction. And I feel like in a great novel, the setting is kind of another character in the book, and it couldn't take place anywhere else. And I did feel that way about this as a person who's been to Madison a bunch of times, and there's a lot of people who went to school there. And I was curious, like, about how you feel the location plays a role in this. Like, and could you imagine it being set anywhere else? And like, how does it have to do with Charlie and his family and Leah's isolation in Madison? And
yeah, I played with the idea of having it somewhere else, but it just like, it felt like it had to be in Madison, and to me it was very tied up in being at this MFA program, and I also went to the MFA program in Madison, although the book is fictional, but it, like, I had so many of these visceral details that I could pull from, but to me, like, putting Leah kind of in this like very like tight insular writing program, like in this, I mean, it's a city, but it also has this like small Midwestern town feel, as opposed to, like, you know, she lives actually in Brookline here, but, you know, putting her in the Midwest, in this graduate program made sense to me because it, you know, Leah's a character who it almost echoes the feeling she has, like, in her family or in other places where she feels a bit like an outsider, and I think Charlie is kind of this interesting character who in some ways is both an insider and an outsider because he's a local there, and she's very, very drawn in by his family and by he has a home there, and she feels, you know, she's so looking for a sense of place and a sense of home, and hominess, and Charlie and his mom sort of like give that to her. But he's also an outsider, and I think she's pulled in by that. So I think Madison just feels, I don't know, like it fits her.
yeah,
I don't know if that's at all what you were picking up on, or if it was something else.
I was thinking it's interesting, like, in a way, so I went to undergrad in a small town in Ohio, and occasionally someone from, like, our, you know, elite liberal arts college would date someone who just lived in the town, like a townie or whatever, and it was definitely seen as kind of like a crazy thing to do, you know, but also like a really enticing thing to do. And I was thinking that there's a little bit of that dynamic with them. But what you just said leads me to my next question, which is about setting the book, you know, in this MFA program. Like, a lot of your characters, and when I feel like I want to say, and I think those of you who read it will feel the same way, one thing that's so wonderful about the book are all of your secondary characters are so fully developed and wonderful and rich, and you feel like you know them all. And I almost want like a spin-off book about Vivian or whatever. And there's like a slight bit of satire about the literary world, just a little like gentle, lovely satire about MFA programs in the literary world. And I wondered about making the choice to make Leah a writer and to set it in this kind of hothouse environment and this very elite environment within, you know, obviously a prestigious school, but you know, a much more kind of like hyper prestigious part of a prestigious school.
Yeah, that was another thing that I thought about was like, what, like, do I make Leah a writer? Because a lot of people don't seem to like when writers write about writers.
Exactly, that's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
You get a lot of pushback. Like, if people are
Yeah.
like, no one will read this, like 4 people will want to read this book. Like,
Yeah.
and they'll all work in publishing and they're writers. That seems to not always be true.
Yeah, and like especially about MFA programs, people aren't so thrilled. But like, I think like we're kind like I was kind of like writing about Leah like as she's just like she's kind of like figuring herself out and like she's really, you know, wanting. I mean, she's writing. She's like wanting to, you know, publish and in a way. In a way, I was thinking about how, like the different ways that like we, or especially Leah, like loses herself, or like and not like putting a judgment on like what are good ways to lose yourself and which aren't, but like one way that Leah does lose herself is like through writing or through stories. Another way she loses herself is through relationships. And how does she, you know, kind of this struggle of like how can you do both at the same time? Is it possible to do both at the same time? And then she kind of, you know, starts getting obsessed with this idea of like, you know, success and validation, and that's something that she's like seeking both from the literary world and from Charlie or men or relationships. And I think that in some ways Charlie is like seeking the same things, but he's kind of up against more because he's struggling so much with his addiction. Charlie is a musician, and I think they connect over that, you know, but so she's, you know, she's kind of forming her own identity with her writing, but she tends to put her relationship first, but like do you have to put one first over the other?
Yeah, and like, is it a sign of I'll just use the term like toxic or bad or emotionally abusive relationship if you kind of lose your ability to lose yourself in your creative process, because she kind of can't write. Like once he moves in with her, she has so much trouble.
Oh, she doesn't write
She
at all.
can't write at all. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's like he's taking up all the space in her brain. The final question I'm going to ask you about the relationship is, I was so interested in the kind of the way you explore an almost moral question, or really, no, an actual moral question, which is kind of like, what is her responsibility to Charlie? Like once she becomes involved with him, there's a way in which she feels like it would be unethical to leave. Like she's so immersed in his well-being and his family and her mother, his mother is dependent on her, and it's a question, you know, without an answer, right? But I think it is something that maybe a lot of people have felt, right? And it gets at questions of like, if you are someone's caretaker, can you actually also have a creative life? You know, like kind of larger universal questions.
Well,
I didn't really ask you a question.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, I don't know what I was doing there.
I mean, I think it's probably a question she was asking herself all the time. Like, if I was her friend, I would tell her she can leave. You know, I think like, but I think she, you know, if you're like so deep in with some, you know, she starts believing that, you know, you know, that, you know, she's, yeah, it's a really hard question when you feel like you're, you know, the best thing in someone's life who's kind of holding on by a string. It feels heartbreaking to leave. And I think like in some ways he was also that for her.
Mm-hmm.
Even though like she kind of appears like the healthier one in the relationship, but I don't think she's doing all that well either.
Yeah, there are a few remarkable moments in the book where I sort of like put the book down and realized that I had been so subsumed in Leah's point of view that I had kind of lost sight of things. And one of them is this moment that gets at what you're saying, where she says, there was something in me, a part of myself that had been there long before I'd ever met Charlie, that had found something in him that I simply could not let go of. And it's like she needs him too, but I wondered, that thing that he brings out in her, is it possibly a kind of self-destructive impulse that she herself has too?
I don't know. I mean, there, like,
Okay,
I
you can
think,
just not
yeah,
answer that question.
no.
It's okay.
I think like one thing that, you know, comes up a lot in the book is like, you know, people are asking Leah a lot, like, you know, why are you going back to Charlie? Like, why are you in this relationship? And I think it's like, it's a question that, it's like we've all probably been asked that, or like we've asked it to someone else. And I think like ultimately, like it was kind of, I think it was the reason that I wrote the book. I was like kind of trying to figure out like why does Leah stay in this relationship? And I think it's this feeling, this like kind of indescribable feeling, and like it's like not quite love, but it's something. And like my hope is that the book sort of captures what it is that like that feeling that keeps her coming back, and that it like resonates.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna pause to ask, who has questions for Hanna? I just want to gauge how many questions we have. Okay, why don't we start, because I bet there are more. Usually when I say that, like no one raises their hand, and then whatever, so there are already 5, that's a lot. Go ahead.
So, a little while earlier you had mentioned that you had a heightened sense of urgency, you experienced a heightened sense of urgency when you were writing this book, and that was sort of the nature of their relationship as well. I think you have transferred that to us. And I have never felt like wanting to read a book so badly. My question was, where can I buy a copy?
Here, right now, right after this.
Yeah, like, so I'm getting a copy, and then probably I'll come back with many more questions.
Okay, who else has questions? Oh, yeah.
So as a question, in terms of your kind of wondering how the audience or how the reader was going to perceive the story, what's it like to have reviews come in and have now like hearing different people respond to it when you've kind of been more identified with the main character?
The question was like not not knowing how people were going to respond to it, and then like reading reviews or hearing people's responses. And I think like, I mean, it just came out today, so like I still haven't heard that many, but it's been really amazing, because I think people are like resonating with like the messy, like vulnerable feelings that like it's been good so far.
So you told us that this came out really quickly. You said this was a fast book to write. I'm just wondering how that compares to your first book, and kind of what the writing process was like for this sophomore novel, and compared to it first.
Writing the first book took a lot longer. I think the first book was kind of more, it was like probably like a 5-year process, and it was much more like trial and error, like point of view, and like piecing, even just like figuring out like timelines, and like the revision process took like years, and I don't know, this book just came out much more seamlessly. I don't really know why.
Do you think it's practice from the first?
No.
It sounds like you were mentally preparing in ways that you didn't know, like your subconscious was preparing you to write this book.
Yeah, I think this book had been like brewing in my mind for like years, and then like once I was ready to write it, I wrote it.
I have a very boring process question as well. Sorry, generic writer Q&A question. Do you have, I know you started out as a short story writer, and now you've published 2 novels. Do you have advice for writers who like, or can you speak to your experience about writing short stories versus writing novels, like coming back to the same world, the same story over and over, how do you think that? What's the difference between those two, processes like for you?
I wish I had some good advice, except that I think with like
Do you want to come back to it?
Yeah, let me think on
Okay.
it. Nothing great comes to me. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, this is sort of following the last 2 questions. And one thing you said when you wrote this book, you started with this first scene, and it really, you really could move on through the momentum. Did you, when you were writing it, did you feel like you had to have signposts of scene to scene, and you sort of filled them in, or did you just let it come out? Because I think as writers, there's one part of school, you sort of let it all come out. And then you think, no, you have to have scenes to build it. And I wonder if when you were writing this, did you use both techniques, or did you kind of merge them?
I kind of let it come out, but I would often have scenes like in my mind that I knew I was writing towards, and that would sort of, and I think that was part of the urgency. Like there were certain scenes that I just knew I wanted to get to, and I almost like couldn't write fast enough. Like I was like, I need to get to this part. I need to get to this part. And one thing that I did a lot of, and I don't know if it was because it was during the pandemic, but every day while I was writing, I would take really long walks, and I would often think about what I had just written and think about what I was going to write. And I don't know, there was something about like walking and thinking about like the world of the novel, with like things would sort of start to, I felt like I was kind of like swimming in the novel a bit, and scenes would like blurry ideas of scenes would sort of start to like form, and again, like nothing else was going on in my life, so like this was like the thing that I was doing. I was working too, but like but I would get back and then sort of get back to editing what I had just done, and then keep writing.
So the silver lining of the pandemic.
Yeah, I feel bad saying that, but like,
Yeah.
I was wondering, so like in a book where the characters are so complex and there's just so much to them, when you were writing the book and like when you were making the characters, like how much of the kind of world around you, like yourself, did you put in to Leah or to Charlie, and how did you kind of form them into like characters with, they're like so dimensional and there's so much that contradicts them, like within themselves, and how did you kind of know what to keep in and what to leave out about them?
That's such a good question. I think, with Leah, there's a lot of me in Leah, but it was really helpful at the beginning to, like, Leah's not me, and there was like some certain, like I think I was like 32 when I was writing the book, and Leah's 25, and I even just made some like core differences about her, like they were very superficial, but like, she's in the book, she's like 6 feet tall, and like I have some like weird body stuff where I think of I don't do it, but like I in my mind she was not me, but I took some parts of myself and like I magnified that, and I think one thing that like really helped was my first book hadn't come out when I was writing this book, so I didn't really like have a conception of what it would be like to have this book read by anyone, and so I was kind of able to take like the fear of like anyone being like, oh, is this Hannah, like, and I was able to just like take any ego or, because Leah, one thing that people are saying in like the Goodreads reviews is like Leah's not very likable.
Really?
And, yeah, but it's okay.
I haven't read those.
Yeah, but like I think because I was able to not like worry about that, I could make her a very honest character, and I think like the guys in the book, like I was able to pull from people I knew, but none of them are a specific person, and then make up details, but that's how I always tend to write, like, is pulling stuff from life and then making stuff up and having it be this like weird composite.
Do you guys have other questions?
So this is a question for both of you. It's such an elaborate project. I found myself thinking, like, how do you know you're done?
Do you want to answer that?
Go ahead.
I just knew. I got to the final scene and like I was just like, this is. I know that's not a good answer.
I think sometimes you just know. I've had that experience with one book, and then sometimes you don't, and you're kind of like, where do I land? I'm wondering what you think about this, but one of my favorite writers is Laurie Colwin.
Me too.
So and she has this lost story that just came out, which I haven't read yet, but I read an interview with her child, who was talking about the concept of happy endings and how Laurie Colwin's novels and stories are kind of always working toward a happy ending, in Laurie Colwin terms, which doesn't necessarily mean like actual happiness or resolution. It just means kind of like the end of a journey, or like something has changed or transformed. And sometimes you don't totally know where, like when that transformation has happened, and sometimes you do, don't you think?
Yeah.
Like in everything, in essays and short stories, for me at least, in everything. Sometimes it just is there, and sometimes you're like working and working until you get to it.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like you'll end up writing past the ending, and then like someone else will look at it and they'll point out where the ending actually is, and it'll be like,
That's
oh,
so true.
That's where it is. Yeah.
Yes, I used to be a magazine editor, and that was actually so common
Mm.
that so often, you know, a writer would turn in like a big piece of narrative nonfiction, and I'd be like, wait, we don't even need these last 2 pages. Like, this is a perfect place to land, and let's just cut all of this. And they would usually be like, no, what? And but I would be right. Do you guys have other questions?
I guess in line with that, are there any scenes, chapters, big chunks maybe that you cut, but that to make the book better overall, but that you still really like, and that you're like, I wonder if I could have made that work, or was everything that you wrote something that stuck?
I don't, nothing that stands out that I remember cutting. Can you think of anything from any of your books that?
I can give one example that actually relates directly to this novel, which is in my last book, My Salinger Year. There's a character who I guess is like analogous to the Charlie character. He's like a terrible boyfriend character who kind of like sucks all the air out of the room, and he's also like misogynist and like horrible and like thinks of himself as like a modern day Norman Mailer and whatever. And in real life, so it's a memoir, and in real life, you know, this person was like that, and was like loathed by all my friends who were like, why are you dating him? Break up with him, he's horrible. And in the first draft of the book, there was a lot more of him, and a lot more of the kind of like truly, honestly, like terrible, like literally terrible things that he did. And I ended up cutting a lot of it, in part because my editor said, you know, you don't want him to take over the book. You don't want the focus to be on him, and you also don't want the focus to be on why you were with him. You know, that's not the story of the book. That's not the primary story. So I did cut big swaths from that book, just specifically about that character. So it's like the opposite of this book.
But yeah, it's like when I think of My Salinger Year, like he was like a brushstroke in it, but not the heart of the book.
That's exactly the word that I use for myself, a brushstroke.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you guys have other questions that I will not answer?
Do you have anything else or something that you're working on next?
I have some stuff that's percolating, but nothing.
Okay, I bet we have to end soon. So I'm gonna ask you the question that I ask everyone when I do these events, which is, what are you reading now, or what's the last book that you read that you absolutely loved?
Oh, that's a great question. I really liked the book Strangers to Ourselves by Rachel Lee. Yeah, it's a nonfiction book it's about like mental illness and like psychiatry and like how diagnoses and like the stories we tell ourselves and like and basically like stories like doctors tell us about ourselves sort of like form like our lives and what we think about ourselves. And it's nonfiction, but it kind of reads like a novel almost, or like it's like a page turn. It kind of follows maybe like 5 or 6 different people and their lives, and it's like it's so beautifully written and really, really, really good. Yeah.
I loved it too. I kept putting it down and like forcing my husband to listen to past it. I was like, you have to hear this. And yeah, he was like, enough about mental illness. Okay, thank you guys.